4, verses 1 through 9, if you would like to follow along with me. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is the source not your pleasures that wage war in your body parts? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. And you are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with the wrong motives, so that you may spend what you request on your pleasures. You adulteresses, do not know that friendship with the world is hostility towards God. Therefore, whoever wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think that the scripture says to no purpose? He jealously desires the Spirit whom he has made to dwell in us, but he gives a greater grace. Therefore it says, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit therefore to God, but resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God, and he will come close to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be miserable and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy into gloom.
An extra freebie verse on the slides. Good morning. It is good to be together this morning. I'm enjoying spring as it begins and continues to kind of open up. One of my favorite memes about the suffering I endure every year is something like, "Oh, it's spring. Can you feel it?" And it's this kid just all congested. His eyes are swollen shut. And said, "Yeah, I can feel it." But as the world starts to wake up, to come back to life, to model the resurrection spring always does for us, thinking about the flowers and just the smell of spring as often as I'm able to actually smell it. And reminds me of the fact that our prayers in Revelation are said to go up to God like the incense. The altar of incense is actually, it has a bowl of our prayers, the prayers of the saints. And then we also have in 2 Corinthians 2 that we are carrying about with us the fragrance of the knowledge of God. We are the aroma of life to those who are being saved and the aroma of death to those who are perishing. And maybe they feel kind of congested around us like I do around too many flowers. But those were some sweet thoughts. Maybe we think about as we're enjoying the season. We are enjoying the season, right? We remember to enjoy the season at least sometimes. We should. This morning, of course, we're continuing our series on elder qualifications. And so, as has been mentioned before, we're kind of using Titus as the base in terms of the order that we're going through. That said, we're not strictly going in order. We're picking whatever the next one is, and then at this point, so far, we've really focused on one thing at a time. We've talked about being above reproach as the overarching qualification. We'll continue to treat it that way. We talked about being a one-woman man. We talked about being the father of faithful children, or being above reproach as a father. And this morning, we're talking about the one that comes after that. So reproach is mentioned again if we're looking in Titus chapter 1. After he says, if anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. For an overseer as God's steward must be above reproach. So that's not new information. That's explaining why the instruction is given in verse 6. And then we have the first bit of new information following that in verse 7. He must, and ESV says, he must not be arrogant. So it's not that arrogant is our key, but that's the first one we're going to pick up. We're going to combine it with the last, with the second to last and third to last from verse 8. Not because they're second and third to last. We don't just like confusing patterns that don't really exist or take longer to explain than they do to find. But because I think this trio kind of helps us understand these different elements. So we're talking about mostly we can call this lesson being above reproach in holiness, because we're going to kind of see that has the most to do with these concepts. But really, we're going to talk about being above reproach and not being self-pleased. I'll explain that language here in a second. Holy and righteous. So these are the three that we're taking together. Hopefully it'll make sense to you the way that it's made sense to me to think about these things together, even though they're not listed immediately together in the text. But you can take home with you and know that because we're talking about not arrogant or not self-willed in the New American Standard, we'll look at in a second, that the next one will include quick-tempered. Okay, so you'll have to wait and see what else we throw in with quick-tempered. But today we're talking about arrogant from verse 7, or self-willed, upright and holy, or righteous and holy, depending on which translation you're using. So that's what we're talking about this morning. And again, I'm excited to get further into the discussion on these points in class next Sunday. But I'll do a quick work through of kind of what we should be thinking about with each of these ideas to get started, and hopefully further study, further rumination, further conversations outside of this place will help us be prepared to discuss next week, Lord willing. So first, we have this idea of not being self-pleased. The only translation I found that uses this is Young's literal translation. We kind of picked up that was one of the ones on our list last time when we were talking about a one-woman man, and it translated it slightly more literally. This is the word here for arrogant, or I'll throw up what all the variety of words that I've found, and you can look at this while I talk about it. So depending on which translation you look at, you're going to find these words. I couldn't find any other words than this, but these were all the translations I think that I looked at. The Greek word that they're translating here is a cool little portmanteau, and it's not odd to find compound words in Greek. They did that maybe more than we do. No part of it is head or strong. No part of the Greek word is over or bearing. Those are compound words, but those aren't the words involved. The first part of the Greek word is the word we get auto, like self. And then the other part is the word that we get hedonism from. Okay? So the pursuit of your own desires. So, and I'm not making this a Greek study. In fact, I'm using these words to avoid getting into the Greek study. But I do like what Young's literal did, because that's kind of what the original word is getting at. Now, if you are most concerned about pleasing yourself, that is arrogant, that's egocentric. There's a few other words that we can call it, and some of these might or might not be the words that we pick for that. I'm not sure how much the intent of what we're looking at is about being bossy or pushy or overbearing or being kind of mean about what you want. I'm not sure how much of it is about the kind of inflated sense of or view of self that we usually think about when we think about arrogance. I'm not sure how much of that is intended in the text, but what I do want to remind you of is that by doing this, we kind of see a bunch of different angles of a word or an idea that has a bunch of different angles for us to consider. So better even than choosing one translation and just saying, well, it definitely means what this one says, we can open up and say, okay, well, probably mostly means this. Maybe I think it mostly means this, but we also have some other things to think about, and kind of rounds out our picture, our understanding of what we're talking about. The last thing I want to say from a word perspective is with the idea of the language of being self-willed, which shows up in a few translations that I really, really respect. we don't use will now quite the way that we used to, and I think the way that we probably should. For example, and I don't remember if I've talked about this here before or not, but there's a common parenting book like Parenting the Strong-Willed Child, right? Familiar with that? And we think about a difficult child maybe as being, well, they're just really strong-willed. It's kind of putting a nice name on the behaviors or whatever it is. What I want to suggest to you is maybe a better way to think about that is that what the child is actually doing, and what anybody who's strong-willed is actually doing, is that they're strongly attached to their passions. They're strongly attached to their flesh and their own desires. We would say that discipline, which pulls you out of yourself and enables you to do the righteous thing instead of the thing that you maybe crave or desire for yourself most, is willpower. The idea of your will is actually comes more with the ancient idea of your heart and the courage that it takes, the heartiness that it takes to subdue your passions and your flesh and do what you know to be right or good. So that's not so much about self-will, that's mostly a freebie, kind of an aside. But we should be thinking about somebody's willpower when we think about the office of an elder. But that's not so much what comes in here, other than we're thinking about somebody who isn't so much concerned with pleasing themselves. That's why I like Young's literal better. They're not so much concerned with their passions or their flesh. That's not what they put first. They are most concerned with righteousness and holiness, as we'll see for verse 8. So while we're here, though, and kind of giving it its time in the sun as a standalone, what does self-pleased look like? What does it mean to be self-pleased? And there's a myriad of answers. My job isn't to be exhaustive this morning, or exhausting, whatever happens, but to kind of give you some ideas and some ways to start thinking about this. So one of the patterns that we notice in Scripture is that somebody saw something, they desired the thing that they saw, and then they took the thing that they desired, right? And maybe one of the clearest and first examples that we have is Eve in the garden, right? She saw the fruit and that it was pleasing to the eye and good for food and desirable to make one wise, right? And then, so she saw, she's desired or coveted, and then she took, right? Achan at Jericho, right? They were not supposed to take any of the spoils from conquering Jericho. They were supposed to devote it completely, entirely to destruction. But Achan saw something that he liked, right? He desired or coveted that thing, and he took that thing, and as a result, he and his entire household were stoned. Samson had a way of doing this with women. He would be walking along, and he would see a woman that was pleasing to his eyes, right? And he would say, "Dad, I want that one." And it never went well. But that was, again, the pattern of he saw, he desired, he took. David with Bathsheba famously saw, desired, took. Ahab with Naboth's vineyard saw, desired, took, right? These are instances where people were self-willed or self-pleasing. The thing that controlled them, the thing that determined the decision that they made, the actions that they took, was pleasing themselves. That's where it stopped. And I phrase it that way because while we can look at some of these and say, like maybe for Samson, for example, or because it's all we know of Achan, but maybe with Samson or Ahab, we can say these were self-pleasing people. That characteristic kind of sums up their identity, their personality, like this is kind of who they were, was they were self-pleasing. But we look at other people like David, for example, and we say, he definitely had moments, right? And I don't know how much of an understatement it is to say that Bathsheba was him having a moment of being self-pleasing, right? But generally, on a whole, the way that Scripture talks about David and the way that we should talk about David is that this didn't define him, but it was definitely something that marked him and kind of is the asterisk by his name. But we can't disagree with God when we think about David as a man after God's own heart. We have questions, but we shouldn't be disagreeing with God's character statement or summary of David. And so one of the things we're seeing here is that people act self-pleasing, and some people just are self-pleasing, like that's the only way that they act. And so one of our jobs is thinking about, is this something that defines the person? When you look at the way that it's in the qualification, it does not say this man must never have done anything to make himself happy. It doesn't even say this man must never have done anything to make himself happy that he shouldn't have done. It says that he must not be this way. Right? So we're talking about someone's character on the whole. Another kind of aspect or way to think about this is that desiring things is not evil. It's not wrong to have desires. There are things that it's inherently wrong to desire, sure. But the fact that you desire things is not wrong. When we're thinking about, is somebody self-pleasing primarily, does this define them? We're thinking about questions like, okay, it's not wrong to desire something, but what will you do to get it? What lines are you willing to cross? Whose husbands are you willing to bring home from the front lines in hopes that they can give you an alibi or an excuse? Whose husband will you murder to get away with or think that you're going to get away with what you've done or what you want? How many people are you going to lie to get the thing that you want? And then how are you going to act if you can't get it? Do we all remember the picture of Ahab sitting in his room facing the wall like this when his wife finds him? It's one of the clearer images of my mind. And that's all because he couldn't get Naboth's vineyard. He asked nicely, kind of, and Naboth said, "No, man, that's mine. Also, you have like a lot. Like it's not even a matter of a poor brother asking, please, can I have some water? And me being like, no, man, go fend for yourself. Like, you're fine. This is all I got." And so he pouts, he sulks. And that's probably not the most offensive thing that you could do if you can't get what you want, right? But how upsetting is it? How do you respond when you can't get that thing that you want? When you think about the thing that you desire, you might think about the lengths that you would go to get it. You might think about the lines that you absolutely, hands down, will not ever cross. But then do you think about what is your attitude when you're thwarted or when you're disappointed? Or when you're rejected? How do you respond to those things? I think we should be paying attention to that when we think about who is and who isn't qualified to be an elder. We should also be thinking about that as we think about growing into the fullness of the measure of the stature of Christ, right? We should be thinking about that when we think about our own maturing, and man, woman, doesn't matter. Are you self-willed, self-pleasing, arrogant? Are you focused on your own desires? And how do you respond when thwarted? Another word to go with here that would probably require more explaining is the idea of ambition, but not as we mean it now, but as it used to be meant, which is kind of I don't know, it's more than even a workaholic. It's the idea of being insatiable, not the idea of not being complacent and wanting generally to grow and to succeed. That's not the bad or wrong kind of ambition, but the idea of how can I increase me, my name? How can I get more, kind of a greed associated ambition. would probably also be a fair translation here. I just didn't find anybody who agreed with that and also offered a translation of the Bible. This is the reason, this is the last thing I'll hear. This is the reason that I chose for a scripture reading James 4. And I did want it to be 1 through 10 because it talks about humility. But it kind of touches on a lot of our points with righteousness and holiness. But this is one of the few things in Scripture that's directly connected to an unsuccessful prayer life. The other one I can think of quickly is in 1 Peter 3, when it says in verse 7, for husbands to live with your wives in an understanding way. It says, so that your prayers will not be hindered. This idea in James 4 is one of the only other things I can think of that is connected with an unsuccessful prayer life. He says you pray for things, you ask, and you do not have. Why? Because you ask amiss, right? You ask to spend on your own pleasures, on your own desires. You're pursuing your own will. You're insisting, to use the language of 1 Corinthians 13, you're insisting on your own way. This has implications on your prayer life, to say nothing of whether or not you should be an elder in the Lord's church and shepherd the flock of God who is among you. Moving on from this is the first of the two antidotes that we'll consider, which is righteousness. Being above reproach and specifically being righteous. We'll look at a few different words that are used. ESV and some others use upright. We have righteous in a couple, just, pious, fair. I think it's New Century Version, says live right. And all of these are first of all, pretty similar. Second of all, pretty on brand, pretty great picks for the word that we're dealing with. The one I don't love as much, just because we don't use it in a good way very often, is pious. That could just be me. But overall, these are the things that we're thinking about. One of the things that we should be asking when we're thinking, okay, what does righteous look like? One way that we might think is we might think about the Pharisees. I mean, after all, Jesus does say that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. So righteousness is something proactive. It is a positive behavior or characteristic. It's not something that you avoid or don't have. It's something that you do have, and it's apparently measurable, right? It's observable if it's not measurable. It's observable. And so, like, what does it look like? What does this mean? What are we getting at here? So what does righteousness look like? One of the examples or kind of patterns that I would show, this isn't like a three-step thing, but righteousness, I'll suggest to you as a way to think about, is when obedience to God takes a priority over convenience or desire. When you are going to do what's right, even though that's not what's convenient or desirable for you. Someone who is righteous is maybe primarily obedient. Maybe that's one of the ways that we think about it. It won't be on the slide, but I do have another offering. But we can think of Abel, who offered a pleasing sacrifice to God. We can think about Noah, the preacher of righteousness, who in faith obeyed, right? We can read Hebrews 11 and get a good bit of this. Abraham, to whom it was accounted as righteousness when he believed God and obeyed, right, pursuant to that. But also, like David, the same guy from the last slide, who was a bad example, also chose righteousness. I'm thinking maybe most definitively, and I wonder what you think of first, but for me, I think of his fleeing from Saul and his constant resolve not to lay a hand against the Lord's anointed. His obedience to, and it's not just obeying a command, right? It's a clinging to the upright path. It's a clinging to God's character and behavior over what would be convenient or desirable. Remember that when Saul is pursuing David, David had been anointed by Samuel. He was the legitimate king of Israel, and God had rejected Saul from being king. It would have been, in many ways, right. If the story went differently, you and I wouldn't bat an eye. If one of those times, if David had gone into the cave and had killed Saul and claimed the throne, I don't know, like if that was the only way we knew the story to go, I don't think we would challenge that. I don't think we would bat an eye. But instead of what's convenient for him as the king of Israel, he chooses a path of righteousness. He chooses to do what he knows to be in line with the character and nature of his God. So while obedience is maybe the primary offering, I wonder what you think about when you think of a word like faithfulness. And I know we've been talking about this a little bit because the elders' children must be faithful. And so we've been thinking about this a little bit. But when you think about just maybe dump that for a minute and think about a faithful Christian. I tell you so-and-so is a faithful Christian. What do you think about? Like what kind of conduct do you think about? And here I would encourage you to go to places like maybe Psalm 1, that blessed is the man who is righteous. Or the Psalms about who can go up to the Lord's house, who can ascend the mountain of the Lord, right? The one who is blameless, has clean hands, a pure heart, things like that. Like, I would be thinking about passages like that, but I would also be thinking about examples of people who were righteous. Interestingly, and I think it's Peter in one of his letters that calls him righteous Lot, who, while he was living in the cities and the plains. Righteous Lot. Think about what kind of life he might have been living to have that kind of reputation. One of the ways that I think about righteousness, to kind of sum this up and move on because I want to focus on holiness, really comes down to when you know God, you are going to act in a godly way, regardless of what's convenient. I tend to associate the idea of righteousness, and I do like being upright, which might also help us think of Job. He was blameless, upright, feared God, turned away from evil. You are deliberately using your willpower to force your flesh to submit to God in all things, whether it's obeying a specific command, not transgressing specific commands, or generally doing good, like being rich in good works, which as we move on, I'll remind you is kind of one of the main themes or main points in Titus is good works. He talks in chapter 1, towards the end of chapter 1, I believe, about those who are unfit. Yeah, verse 16, unfit for any good work. And then throughout the rest, he's talking about being prepared for good works, being diligent to good works, to do good works, right? Rich in good works. So we should be actively doing good, not sinning, actively doing good, right? So with that, like, what does it mean if it's different at all? I think it's a shade different. What does it mean to be above reproach in holiness? Just some more in our studies. There is a lot less variety here. I chose not to give you the obnoxious list of translations that put the word holy here. That's definitely the word we should be thinking about. These are some creative minds who got together and thought, is there another word though? And I don't hate what they chose. We're not too familiar with the word temperate that Darby chooses. But pure, we understand. Reverent, the Message translation uses. New English translation and New Living Translation say devout. And so what do we think about? What do we think it means when we talk about holiness. I don't like getting too far from known definitions like being set apart or belonging entirely to God. Which means, first of all, that we're not enslaved to the world. Like, we don't belong to anyone else. We serve no other master. We belong entirely to God. But brethren, I think this is the key to abstaining from self-pleasing behaviors and clinging to righteousness. I believe that holiness is the bridge from one to the other. We know that, for example, I think it's 1 Corinthians 6, where it gives the list of all the kinds of people who will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. And then it says, in probably verse 10 or 11 or so, and such were some of you, but what? But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified. In other words, you have been cleansed, you have been purified, and you have been devoted to a purpose in God's house. So you are no longer unclean, and you are no longer enslaved to any master other than God, including your own passions and desires. So when we think about holiness, and I don't know if it's helpful for you, but something that occurred to me as I was thinking about this is that we can once again look at something he says about the widows in 1 Timothy chapter 5. If you look, this isn't on the screen for you, but in 1 Timothy chapter 5, beginning in verse 9, we looked at this before because it has similar language to the instruction for the qualification for the elder to be a one-woman man. 1 Timothy 5, we'll just look at 9 and 10, where he says, "Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work." I wasn't sure whether this fit more with righteousness or holiness, but the reason I put it in with holiness is because it reminds me a bit of Anna that we read about in Luke chapter 2, who's a widow that we see described, who in Luke 2, verse 36, there's a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel from the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin, and then as a widow until she was 84. She did not depart from the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer night and day. And coming up at that very hour, the hour they brought Jesus to be dedicated at the temple, she began to give thanks to God and to speak of him to all who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. This woman was living her life devoted to holiness. I think this overlaps with the picture that we have of the widows indeed in 1 Timothy 5. Here we have a very temple-based idea of both worship and holiness, because we're still under the old covenant when we get into Luke chapter 2. In the new covenant, we see devotion to the temple, meaning devotion to one another, serving one another. Amber, because she has a brain a little bit like mine, ended up reading Hebrews, because she was copying Matthew 18. And the natural thing to do when you're copying Matthew 18 is to read the entire book of Hebrews. Well, since yesterday was our work day here, she sent me Hebrews 6, verse 10, which tells us to know for sure. This wasn't planned in my sermon, so I didn't have this marked. But we know where Hebrews is. Hebrews 6 and 10, where it says, "For God is not unjust so as to overlook your work and the love that you have shown for his name in serving the saints, as you still do." It's reminiscent of Jesus saying in Matthew 25 that as much as you've done it to the least of these, my children, you've done it to me. Or my brothers, you've done it to me. Zooming back out a little bit and thinking about, okay, somebody is holy. We're supposed to think about appointing a man who is holy. What does that mean as a character description? What would you think if I was introducing you to a new friend, and I said, this is This is my buddy Ben, and he is the most holy man that I've ever known. What would have to be true, do you think, for me to offer that as a description? I want you to play with that. But one of the things that I want you to think about in terms of making that true about your life is that you wake up in the morning and you remind yourself as often as you need to kind of snap out of something and think objectively about the situation you are in and the decisions you're making, is that the defining truth of your life is that you were bought with a price and you belong to the creator of the universe. That's what defines you. Maybe your picture of holiness is really tied to an idea like piousness or devoutness that's maybe tied to pilgrims, or maybe it's tied to the Pharisees and the way that they thought about righteousness and holiness. Maybe it's tied to, before the Pharisees, the actual like Levitical priesthood and system as it was designed and intended and instructed in the Old Testament. Would you describe, though, Jesus's life during his ministry, would you describe it as holy? It's like if I'm giving you a true, false, or a yes, no question, like, was Jesus holy during his ministry? You say, well, yeah, obviously. I'd be like, okay, show me the holiness. Show me his holiness in the Gospels. Show me where he was walking about and did something that was holy. What I want to impress upon your minds this morning is that holiness does not mean a austerity or severity that's unrealistic. It is not the asceticism, to use a word I know we all know and love. It's not the imposed hardness on the flesh. The monks who go out and decide that they can't know any comfort. That's not the biblical picture of holiness, even in the Old Testament, but certainly in the New Testament. It's the idea that in everything that you do, here's a way to put it, whatever you do in word or in deed, do all in the name of the Lord, meaning with the authority of and acting on behalf of the Lord. So, in other words, for your own sake, as you think about maturing in your own lives, remembering holiness, both as a de facto state that you're in because God has saved you and cleansed you, and as a defining truth that you've chosen to belong to God and to be used for his service. Grow in holiness away from self-will, self-pleasing ways, and towards righteousness. I've probably carried on a little bit, but I do want to end with a psalm that I think expresses some of this. Psalm 139. It's a psalm that's been close to my heart for many years. But I want you to see if you notice some of these themes as we read this psalm together, and then the lesson is yours. Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all together. You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake and I am still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me, for they speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. See if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. If there's any grievous way in you, or if there's any way we can help you come closer to the God who created you, let us know by coming forward as we stand.